You're tired of Samuel. I didn't pick the book. That was him. Yeah. Mm-hmm. We're live? Okay. Well, we are getting towards the end of our study through Samuel. Last time, we did chapter 19 and talked about the conclusion of the Absalom saga. Joab, of course, killed Absalom and has restored David to the throne, and then we see how David responds and acts in the wake of Absalom's death. Tonight, we're going to cover effectively the aftermath, kind of the conclusion of all of that. This is essentially the end of the narrative of Samuel. And then we're going to get into the beginning of the epilogue. So the last few chapters are sort of extraneous material that's just kind of tacked on. They don't really fit in terms of chronological narrative, which raises all kinds of fun questions about what it's doing there and what we're supposed to learn from it. But we'll kind of touch on that tonight. So we begin in chapter 20, verse 1. Now a wicked man, a Benjaminite named Sheba, son of Bichri, happened to be there. He blew the ram's horn and shouted, "We have no portion in David, no inheritance in Jesse's son, each man to his tent, Israel." So right off the bat, we're introduced to a wicked man and then a Benjaminite, which the way it's set up, it almost seems like it's redundant. We have had an interesting interaction with Benjamin through the history of Israel. Of course, the negative accounts of this begin back in Judges, right? It's in Benjamin that we have the Levite and the concubine story. It is the Benjaminites who resist the judgment of the rest of Israel, and then Israel just about wipes out Benjamin, and it just keeps spiraling from there. And of course, Saul is the first king of Israel. So when we're introduced to yet another Benjaminite who's going to cause trouble, it just sort of tacks on all of this to Benjamin. So Benjamin is, this Benjaminite, he says, "We have no portion in David." Well, this should not be a surprise to us. We were kind of hinted at in the previous chapter. So going back to 1943, the men of Israel answered the men of Judah, "We have 10 shares in the king, so we have a greater claim to David than you. Why then do you despise us? Weren't we the first to speak of restoring our king?" But the words of the men of Judah were harsher than those of Israel. So, and then, who exactly are the 10? Who is being excluded? Because, right, you have the 10 tribes, and then you have Judah. That's, my math isn't great, but that should only be 11. So one is left out. Is Benjamin left out, or is it one of the other tribes? It's unclear. But we're already introduced to this problem, right? David, even though he's been reestablished supposedly as the king of all Israel, is showing favoritism to Judah. And the other tribes have already voiced their not very happy about it. And David was warned, you can't do this. If you show favoritism to Judah, it's going to alienate the other 10. They're not going to be very happy. And David's doing it anyway. So now you have this Bichri guy who stands up and says, we're being excluded. We're not being treated like full citizens of Israel because David is showing partiality to some tribes over others. This is not good. Not good. So, verse 2, all the men of Israel deserted David and followed Sheba, son of Bichri, but the men of Judah from the Jordan all the way to Jerusalem remained loyal to their king. So Judah is still backing David, which shouldn't surprise us because David has shown favoritism to Judah. The Judahites are happy. They're as happy as can be because they're basically being elevated over their brethren, which David shouldn't be doing as king of all Israel. And since Sheba is pointing out, we're not being treated as fairly as the others, we're just going to split. So David has literally just reclaimed the throne, and he's now staring down the barrel of another civil war, mostly because of his own ineptitude. And again, this was already sort of hinted at or sort of foreshadowed in chapter 19 when the Judites, right, they said, why shouldn't we? Basically, why shouldn't we receive better treatment because he's our relative? This was one of the problems of elevating a member of one of the tribes because there was always the risk that he would be partial to his tribe, his family, over the others. So the Judites, again, they're like, we're happy with the situation. I mean, why wouldn't they be happy? So all of this was set up and foreshadowed at the end of chapter 19. So David's response is to just go back to Jerusalem as opposed to directly dealing with the impending civil war. So in verse 3, when David came to his palace in Jerusalem, he took the 10 concubines he had left to take care of the palace and placed them under guard. So who exactly are these 10 concubines? Well, when David abandoned Jerusalem after Absalom had named himself king in Hebron, David, when he left Jerusalem, left the palace in the care of 10 of his concubines. This is back in chapter 15. And then in chapter 16, when Absalom claims control over Jerusalem, he is advised to take the concubine and to publicly humiliate them. This, of course, is part of the curse that the prophet tells David, right? Because you took a man's wife, someone is going to take your women. So David has come back. He's reclaimed Jerusalem. Everything should be fine. He finds the 10 concubines who have been essentially defiled. And what do you do with the 10 concubines? Well, he doesn't really want them anymore because his son has defiled them. He's not going to let them go because that would cause other problems. In fact, when we get, if we were to get into 1 Kings, we'll find out that one person, one of his descendants, decides that he wants one of his concubines. And when Solomon finds out, he has him killed. So the concubine are off limits. So in verse 3, he provided for them, but he was not intimate with them. They were confined until the day of their death, living as widows. They are essentially cursed. He's not going to touch them, but he can't let them go. As we've already established, I've kind of beaten this, but David is not great around women, nor is his treatment of women particularly great. And this is not the first time he's essentially locked women away and just, put them in a tower or something. This is just par for the course at this point. So in verse 4, the king said to Amasa, "Summon the men of Judah to me within 3 days and be here yourself." Now, I know you're all thinking, who's Amasa? I imagine some of you like to watch soap operas or TV shows or something of that nature, and this is better than any soap opera. We've got intrigue and scandals and violence and all kinds of sex. I mean, this is better. This is just so much better. So Amasa, back in chapter 19, we find out that, right, David took the army away from Joab, the guy who killed Absalom and got the throne back for David. He took the authority from Joab and gave it to Amasa. Amasa is one of his nephews. So is Joab. Joab is the son of Zeruiah, but he just changed it from one nephew to another. And even in chapter 19, the way that it's framed, it does sound a little nepotistic. Well, you're my relative, so why shouldn't you be in charge of the army? Well, I mean, so was Joab, and Joab had been fairly faithful up to this point, but he's going to give it to Amasa. Amasa, who also happened to be the lead commander for Absalom. So his nephew that had betrayed him and went to serve Absalom has now replaced Joab as the head of his army, which doesn't seem like the smartest thing to do. So he has given essentially his first order to Amasa. I need you to rally the army because you're going to lead troops against this new threat. Right? We now have a new impending civil war, and he's going to entrust Amasa to put it out. So verse 5, Amasa went to summon Judah, but he took longer than the time allotted him. Oh no, who could have seen that coming? The traitorous nephew, who was not the greatest guy to begin with, that you replaced your previous pretty successful commander, was unable to rally the troops. Verse 6, so David said to Abishai, now, I know you're all thinking, who's Abishai? If you haven't been paying attention, you should know who these people are. So, going back to our to our genealogy. Abishai is the brother of Joab. He's the older brother of Joab. He has been one of the three main commanders this whole time. Joab has been sort of the main commander, mainly because Joab is crazy. Also, Joab will just do anything, and he gets results. So Joab has kind of been the senior general, but Abishai is one of the other three big generals. So he goes to Abishai, and he says to Abishai, Sheba, son of Bichri, will do more harm to us than Absalom. Take your Lord's soldiers and pursue him, or he will find fortified cities and elude us. Now, how exactly is this Sheba guy more dangerous than Absalom? I don't really know, but David is building up this threat. And I know you're all thinking, who is Abishai's Lord? I mean, I was under the impression that David was king. Who is over him? And who on earth would Abishai be serving if not David? The very next words, Joab's men. This is a rather incredible statement. It's almost as if David knows who Abishai is really loyal to. And not just Abishai, but who the men are really loyal to. The men aren't following him. And the men certainly aren't following Amasa. They're Joab's men. They're Joab's army. But why not just go back to Joab and say, Joab, get the army ready? We can't do that, because that would mean the king would have to go crawling back to Joab and say, would you be commander again? David's not going to do that. Oh, no. So he's going to go to Abishai and tell him, go and get your brother's army. This is just incredible. This is an incredible setup. So verse 7. It's like David's just asking for trouble. If you want not just a civil war, but if you want a general to stab you in the back, this is how you do it. Right? You just go completely around. You humiliated Joab. You go around his back. You tell his brother to get the army, and you do all this setup. I mean, would any of us be surprised if Joab just showed up and stabbed David in the back? I mean, Joab is going to go on a rampage, although it's not going to be against David, which is quite fitting. So verse 7, Joab's men, the Kerethites, the Pelethites, and all the warriors marched out under Abishai's command. So Abishai went, he ordered the army, and the men kind of hopped too. They left Jerusalem to pursue Sheba, son of Bichri. They were at the great stone in Gibeon when Amasa joined them. So the men wouldn't come when Amasa called them, but Abishai called them, and the men came. So they're all gathered together, getting ready to march. And here comes Amasa, who's supposed to be in command, just showing up late. And obviously no one respects him. Obviously he doesn't actually have the authority. I mean, even though David put him in charge, no one's going to follow him. And it's all been Abishai. Verse 8, Joab was wearing his uniform. As if this couldn't get any better. Joab is there. Because, of course, the men aren't following Abishai, they're following Joab. Abishai probably went and told Joab, I need the army. And Joab's not going to just turn it over to Abishai, so he's there with Abishai. And so you've got Abishai, who's technically in charge, because David said you're going to be in charge, even though Amasa is officially the head general. And Joab just happens to be there wearing his uniform. Oh, boy. So Joab was wearing his uniform, and over it was a belt around his waist with a sword in its sheath. As he approached, the sword fell out. This is almost comical. There was a movie that I really enjoyed as a kid. It's a Chinese comedy. It's called Shaolin Soccer. It's about these brothers, and when they were younger, they were sent away to a temple where they studied to be monks. Now they're grown up. They're all doing their own thing, and one of the brothers decides that they should get all into soccer and start a soccer team. So you got all these they're adults now, but they're all former monks, and they decide they're going to play soccer. It's a comedy. And there's a scene where they're playing against another team. and it's just unofficial, it's just for fun, and as they're meeting, and of course they're shaking hands at the beginning of the match, and one of the members just drops a wrench. And then they all just kind of look down and stare at the wrench for a while. Because why on earth would you bring a wrench to a soccer match? Again, this is just a comedy. But I just imagine, right? Here's Joab, who's not supposed to be there, right? Because he's not in control anymore. He's not the general. Actually, it's supposed to be Amasa, but the men aren't following Amasa. They're following Abishai. But the men aren't going to go unless Joab is there. So Joab is there in his uniform, right? Because he's actually the one in command. Everyone knows that, except for maybe Amasa. And he walks up, and he just happens to drop his sword. Like, why did he drop his sword? My guess is because he was pulling it out. So why is he pulling out his sword? Well, in verse 9. Joab asked Amasa, "Are you well, my brother?" Then with his right hand grabbed Amasa by the beard to kiss him. I don't know why he's kissing Amasa. It's a cultural thing. That's fine. I don't know why he's grabbing his beard to do it. That seems like a really odd thing to do. You can say cultural thing, I don't know. It just seems kind of weird. This is obviously, at least what should probably pop into our heads, is the Judas kiss. Right? This is probably what comes to mind. Although, since this did happen first, I guess we should call it the Joab kiss, but that doesn't have quite the same ring to it. Verse 10. Amasa was not on guard. Apparently, he was not the brightest bulb. He was not on guard against the sword in Joab's hand. There's a reason why we high-five, why we shake hands. It's a custom, right? Because if you're shaking someone's hand, you know there's nothing in it. It's a sign of goodwill. You extend your hand, there's nothing in it, and then the other person extends their hand, you can shake hands, because, right, in that moment, it's very hard to someone, right? Because you've shown that there's nothing in your hands. There was a sword in Joab's hand when he did this, and apparently Amasa was not smart enough to notice the sword, and he allowed Joab to grab him. And in the moment of being grabbed and being kissed, Joab then stabbed him with said sword. So the sword is in Joab's hand, and Joab stabbed him in the stomach with it and spilled his intestines out on the ground. Joab did not stab him again, for Amasa was dead. Curse your sudden but inevitable betrayal. Like, what did we think was going to happen? Are we at all surprised that Joab would just straight up murder Amasa? This seemed like a really bad situation. And, of course, I don't feel like I even need to point it out, David is nowhere to be found. Of course, he's not there to oversee any of this, to check in on his generals, to make sure they're playing nice. He has just lit a powder keg and walked away. And, of course, the powder keg explodes with Joab murdering his cousin Amasa. So, verse 10, Joab and his brother pursued Sheba, son of Bichri. One of Joab's, well, before we get to verse 11, he just straight up murdered his cousin. He murdered the guy who's technically supposed to be the head general, and no one seems to notice or care. He did it in front of all the men. This is incredible. And again, it just completely proves how much these men they're in for Joab. They're following Joab. Joab can literally murder someone in front of them, and they're not going to say anything, not going to do anything. And then we get one of the most incredible verses in the second half of 2 Samuel. One of Joab's young men stood over Amasa, saying, "Whoever favors Joab and whoever is for David, follow Joab." Let's really bask in this verse. Whoever favors Joab and whoever is for David, follow Joab. Right? They are equating the service of David as the service of Joab. In fact, they're pretty much elevating Joab over David. There's a reason why Joab is first and why Joab is last. Right? They don't say whoever is for David, follow Joab. Okay, that would kind of make sense. Joab is there to some extent representing David's interests. No, it's whoever favors Joab, follow Joab. Because Joab is in command. Right? Joab is the general. He is the one. At this point, the men aren't following David. right? Because if they did, when David said to Amasa, go and get the army would hop too. They would follow that command. The men aren't following David. They're not loyal to David. They're not loyal to Amasa. They're only loyal to Joab. And this shouldn't surprise us at all. Joab was the one who led the army against Absalom. He's the one who won the war against Absalom. He's the one who killed Absalom. He's the entire reason why David is on the throne, and David hasn't really been doing much of anything the last couple of chapters. And soldiers, it's true to some extent, soldiers are loyal to a paycheck. That's somewhat true. But also, they tend to be loyal to the generals that are successful. And Joab is a very successful general. Verse 12. Now Amasa was writhing in his blood in the middle of the highway. He gutted him and left him there, and I assume he's just bleeding out, although it said he was dead first as soon as he was knifed. And the man had seen that all the people stopped. So he moved Amasa from the highway to the field and threw a garment over him because he realized that all those who encountered Amasa were stopping. When he was removed from the highway, all the men passed by and followed Joab to pursue Sheba, son of Bichri. There's so much about this chapter that's amazing. So the men are supposed to be marching along the road, right? Because they're an army and they're marching. And it's causing a bit of congestion because you got rubberneckers. You know what I'm talking about. You've all experienced it. Some of you have probably done it. You're driving along the highway and there's a wreck on the side of the road. The cars are off the road. The cars are not stopping traffic. And yet you have to slow down because you have to turn and look at it. You have already seen a wreck. I'm sure you've all seen dozens of wrecks. There is nothing new about this wreck. There's nothing that is going to change your life. There is nothing exciting about this other than the fact that it's a wreck, and you want to look at the wreck. So there is a man on the ground, just dead, and all these soldiers have to stop and look at the dead man. They're not going to do anything about it other than just gawking at it. So one of the soldiers has to move the guy out of view and cover him up to stop the congestion. And then they just go back to following Joab. It's not that they have any particular loyalty to Amasa or that they feel sorry for Amasa, that they're going to go and tell David. They're not going to rat out Joab. It's just there's a guy bleeding on the side of the road or a guy dead on the side of the road. Oh, man. Verse 14. Sheba passed through all the tribes of Israel to Abel of Beth-Maachah. All the Berites came together and followed him. So he apparently has fled north, perhaps gaining support or something, and he is now holed up in a city in the far northern part of Israel, somewhere up in Dan. As best as you can see it, you got the map, you got Dan, the tribe of Dan up there in the north, and there's a city called Dan, convenient. It's right there, you probably can't see it, but it's a dot just above the A, and Abel is a tiny little city just to the west of Dan. So roughly where that yellow dot is. I'm sure you're all just on pins and needles wondering where Abel is. Well, that's where it is. Verse 15. Joab's troops came and besieged Sheba and Abel and Beth-Maachah. They built an assault ramp against the outer wall of the city while all the troops with Joab were battering the wall to make it collapse. A wise woman called out from the city, "Listen, listen, please tell Joab to come here and let me speak with him." It's interesting that she knows Joab's in control or that he's the one giving the orders. I don't know how she knew that or if she just assumed and she just happened to be right. Verse 17, when he had come near her, the woman asked, "Are you Joab?" "I am," he replied. "Listen to the words of your servant," she said to him. He answered, "I'm listening." She said, "In the past, they used to say, 'Seek counsel in Abel,' and that's how they settle disputes. I am a peaceful person, one of the faithful in Israel, but you're trying to destroy a city that is like a mother in Israel. Would you devour the Lord's inheritance?" Now, this is actually an interesting little story that should resonate with a similar story that we've already come across. You got someone, a bit of a rebel, who's hiding out in a city, and he's concerned that the king might come to said city and besiege the city, and then the residents might turn on him. This is actually a story of David, right? This is back when David was doing his little Robin Hood thing, hiding out in the forests of Hama, and he's got his band of mighty men. He's got his priest Abiathar with him, and then he goes and he saves Keilah, right? And then he's hiding out in Keilah, but then Saul finds out that he's over there, and he's going to bring the army, he's going to besiege Keilah. And then he's like, well, but the residents wouldn't turn on me if I stayed in Keilah, and then the Lord shows up and says, yeah, you need to leave because Saul will wipe out the city if it means getting to you. So here we have essentially Joab besieging an Israelite city. He probably would destroy the city if that's what he needs to do to get to this rebel leader. Now, again, why isn't David here? Why isn't he with the army? He's just turned his generals loose and said, go and get Sheba. So we have a kind of retelling of this story, at least one that's very similar. And in this case, David is essentially the Saul character, right? Willing to destroy one of his own cities if that's what it takes to get the rebel. Now, you could say, well, but David isn't there. This is all on Joab, and Joab's a little crazy. Fair enough, but that brings us back to the question, why isn't David with the army? Now, fair enough, this brings us to a conundrum that most kings have to face. And that is you have a king. And the king is supposed to be in control of everything. Mainly, that means you've got the civil aspect, but you also have the military aspect. And this is a hard juggling act that you have to balance. Because if you stay in your capital for too long, then you run the risks of your generals going rogue. Clearly, that has happened. Joab is completely rogue. He is crazy. Now, he does his best to act in what he believes is the best, what brings about the best outcome for David, whether or not that's what David wants. Like, he'll kill Absalom because, in his mind, that is what is best for David and Israel, even if David himself said, do not do this. Now, the opposite on this is if the king spends too much time with the army, too much time conquering, too much time worrying about the defense and whatnot, then he runs the risk of someone claiming the throne for himself, right? Because if you're away from the throne too long, then because someone's in charge, right? You've left the city in the care of someone. That person might decide he wants to be king. And the residents may decide, we like the new guy. David has had both of these problems, right? He's had rogue generals, mainly Joab, but he's also had people that have taken authority in his name and have basically proclaimed themselves to be king, mainly Absalom, right? Absalom acting as judge in Jerusalem on behalf of his father and then deciding, you know what, I'm already doing the job, I might as well finish it and just call myself king, which results in a civil war. So David's not doing well on both fronts. Verse 20, Joab protested, never, I do not want to destroy, that is not my intention. I mean, do we really think Joab would not level the city if that's what he needed to do? Of course he would. There is a man named Sheba, son of Bichri, from the hill country of Ephraim, who has rebelled against King David. Deliver this one man, and I will withdraw from the city. The woman replied to Joab, all right, his head will be thrown over the wall to you. The woman went to all the people with her wise counsel, and they cut off the head of Sheba, son of Bichri, and threw it to Joab. I mean, this is exactly what Keilah would have done to David, and God told David, this is what's going to happen to you, right? If the town has to face either you got the destruction of the army, or you can get rid of this one rebel, they're going to kill the one rebel. So he blew the ram's horn, and they dispersed from the city, each to his own tent. Joab returned to the king in Jerusalem. So Joab brought about the end of the rebellion. It seems like it probably wasn't quite as dire as David made it out to be. He's like, oh, this guy could be even a bigger threat than Absalom. That seems like a bit of an overreaction, but regardless, the threat has been dealt with. Verse 23, Joab commanded the whole army of Israel. We're going to stop again. Joab has just resumed command of the army. What? I thought David took that authority away from him. Not only that, but Joab murdered the previous commander of the army. And nothing's going to happen to him? There's not going to be any questions? I mean, for all we know, Joab just straight up lied to David. He goes, Amasa, he fought valiantly, but he just happened to die when we besieged the city or whatever. I mean, maybe Joab lied to him, but I kind of feel like Joab just told David and gloated about it. Yeah, of course I killed him. Why wouldn't I kill him? So this is not the first time we have known Joab to just straight up murder someone that got in his way. He did it, of course, to Abner. But this is the second time he's murdered someone and essentially got away with it, right? That David has not done anything, either to punish Joab or whatever. Now, of course, at this point, David may very well know he can't touch Joab because Joab has the army. If anything happens to Joab, the men will go rogue because the army is not following David. He's left Joab in control of the army for too long, and he already knows the army is not going to follow him. Right? They wouldn't follow Amasa. They even have that little jab. If you're for Joab and you're for David, then you need to follow Joab. The men are more loyal to Joab than David. However, he doesn't completely escape justice, we'll say, because in 1 Kings, on David's deathbed, he will tell Solomon, you got to kill Joab. And I do kind of love how this ends. So this is in 1 Kings 2. You know what Joab, son of Zeruiah, did to me and what he did to the two commanders of Israel's army, Abner, son of Ner, and Amasa, son of Jether. He murdered them in a time of peace to avenge blood shed in war. He spilt that blood on his own waistband and on the sandals of his feet. Act according to your wisdom, and do not let his gray hair descend to Sheol. I do love when people do this, especially parents, right? When parents go, okay, I'm going to give you a choice. You can do A or you can do B, and I'm going to trust you to make the right decision, so long as the right decision is A. So he's like, you do what is according to your wisdom and murder the guy. Make sure that he is dead. So David is on his hit list. I mean, he practically has like a literal list of names that Solomon has to kill as soon as David stops breathing. And Joab is very high on that list. So there is going to be some judgment done to Joab, but it's not going to be for a little bit of time. Verse 23. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was over the Kerethites and Pelethites. Adoram was in charge of forced labor. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilub, was court historian. Shiva was court secretary. Zadok and Abiathar were priests. And in addition, Ira the Jerite was David's priest. And that's basically it. That's the end of the historical narrative. David is back on the throne. He has put down, I say he, but really Joab has put down 2 failed civil wars. Joab is back in control of the army, and to some extent is basically running Israel. David has resumed authority in Jerusalem, and this is basically where 1 Kings picks up, is right after this. So, if you can't already tell, there are 4 more chapters in the book. This brings us to the epilogue. And we've got a couple of stories that are kind of all tacked on. They are not in chronological sequence, which makes their placement a little odd and their relationship to the preceding material a bit difficult to assess. But we're going to go through it. Tonight we're going to do chapter 21. And next week, I did not plan this, but it does work out quite nicely. Next week we'll do David's Song of Thanksgiving, which is chapter 22. So this brings us to one of the most difficult chapters in 2 Samuel, at least morally. And that's saying something, because there's a lot of questionable moral stuff going on in 2 Samuel. That is the accusation of the Gibeonites. And there are 2 ways to read this. You're free to read it in whatever way you see best. There is reading it as though David is following God's will, or David is just doing whatever he wants and saying it's God's will. I have trouble reading it as the former. I see this more as Davidic propaganda. And I use that word very carefully, but I also use it very intentionally. And as we go through, I'll explain why I see it that way. However, if you want to, we'll reassess it at the end, and if you want to see it as David being faithful, that's fine. The moral of the story does not change either way. So, verse 1. During David's reign, there was a famine for 3 successive years. Now, this is not the first time a story has begun with, and there was a famine. In particular, we have the beginning of Ruth. Ruth begins with a famine in the land. Now, this does not necessarily mean divine judgment, although very often it's associated with divine judgment. So, David inquired of the Lord. Okay, that's what he probably should do. After 3 years, I don't know what took him so long, but after 3 years, he's asked God, why is there a famine? The Lord answered, it is because of the blood shed by Saul and his family when he killed the Gibeonites. So, this brings us to a couple of issues. Why all of a sudden, after 3 years of this famine or whatever, why now is there this judgment? And how long since was this massacre? We're going to get back to that question. We've got the good angel versus the bad angel. Is this really, does this sound like something that Yahweh would say? Usually when you have a disaster or some sort of major catastrophe, it's usually pretty close to the event. But this has to have happened sometime after, right? Because this is back when Saul was king. David's been king for a while, presumably. And all of a sudden, there's this divine judgment, and when David asks why, he goes, oh, because there was this, something that Saul did. Okay, so that brings us to another question. Okay, so David says he asked God, and God says it's because something that Saul did. This brings us to how does David confirm that God did this? Now, there are 3 ways. He can ask the priests, a prophet can come to him, or he can inquire of his own. There is no mention of priests, which we would kind of expect. No prophet shows up to him. There's nothing in the text to tell us how it's been confirmed, which means it could very well be that David is just doing this on his own, that he feels like this is what God wants him to do, which is a little suspect. But again, there are 2 ways to read this, and I'm not going to tell you exactly how to read it, and the moral doesn't change. So, verse 2. The Gibeonites were not Israelites, but rather a remnant of the Amorites. The Israelites had taken an oath concerning them. Now, this is true. Whether or not you remember the Gibeonites, that's fine. Their story is in Joshua 9. So Joshua is taking over the land, and he was told, don't make any treaties with any of the locals. So the Gibeonites basically lie and say that they've moved in and that they were being oppressed by the locals, and they asked Joshua to make a treaty with them and to take care of them. He says he will, and then like, oh, psych, we're actually part of the locals, and now you can't kill us. And so Joshua agrees to honor the treaty. So they have a history of lying. And they have a treaty with the Israelites that's true, but it's also based on not the best grounds. Joshua was told not to make the treaty anyway. It's actually one of Joshua's, kind of one of his big mistakes. So we've already got a people group that has a kind of a sketchy history with Israel. Verse 2. But Saul had tried to kill them in his zeal for the Israelites and Judah. So, when did this happen? I asked for those of you who've been here, we've gone through the entirety of Samuel. Anyone remember? When Saul went on a killing spree and wiped out the Gibeonites, or at least tried to, or ordered it? Maybe because it's not in the Bible. There's absolutely nothing to corroborate this. There's nothing at all remotely like this. The worst thing Saul ever does is, yes, he orders the cleansing of the temple, which results in some priests being killed. But he never just straight up orders a people group, especially one that's under his protection, to be wiped out. It's really hard to pin this down on any one moment or period of time in Saul's reign. It's actually not a bad argument that I've heard that this may not even have been Saul. This might have been Ishbosheth, who we know had a run-in with the Gibeonites and went to war with them. So it's possible that this is actually because of Ishbosheth's fighting with the Gibeonites, and that the Gibeonites are just going to David and being like, oh, we've been mistreated by Saul, when in fact it was actually his son that went to war with them. But that was not a massacre, and that certainly wasn't necessarily, a genocide. But that's a little suspect because, again, that wouldn't be Saul, that would be Ishbosheth, and that would be the Gibeonites misleading David. But could the Gibeonites be lying to David? They've lied before. So verse 2. So David summoned the Gibeonites and spoke to them. he asked the Gibeonites, "What should I do for you, and how can I make atonement so that you will bring a blessing to the Lord's inheritance?" Why is he asking the Gibeonites for forgiveness? This is a weird thing. Why doesn't he go to Yahweh and say, "What do I need to do to atone?" Why is he, and has he been instructed? There's so many questions that this doesn't quite fit what we would normally expect in a narrative. Verse 4, the Gibeonites said to him, "We are not asking for money from Saul or his family, and we cannot put anyone to death in Israel. Whatever you say I will do for you," he said. David is a terrible negotiator, and you should not tell another people group that you'll just do whatever they say, whatever your demands are. That's a terrible tactic. And we have multiple places in Scripture where you shouldn't make these kind of open-ended deals. We've got Jesus saying it, we've got Ecclesiastes saying this, and of course we've got Moses saying, if you make a deal, you got to stick to it. So David's like, okay, what do I need to do? Whatever you say, I'll do my best to fulfill it. This does not seem like a great strategy from David. Verse 5. They replied to the king, "As for the man who annihilated us," well, you're obviously still alive, so, it's not like you were completely wiped out, "and plotted to destroy us so we would not exist within the whole territory of Israel, let 7 of his male descendants be handed over to us so we may hang them in the presence of the Lord at Gibeah of Saul, the Lord's chosen." Well, the correct response would be, go eat sand. Why on earth would I just turn over some people because you claim that their father or ancestor did something wrong? I need to confirm this. I need to make sure that this is the right and just thing to do. That's what David should do. And of course, he just immediately says, okay, I'll hand them over. It is funny to me that David is never more obedient than when it involves killing Saul's family. And this, of course, is in the wake of not one, but 2 promises he made, one to Saul and one to Jonathan, that he would not annihilate Saul's family. He would not betray them. He would not turn them over. He wouldn't do this exact thing. Verse 7. David spared Mephibosheth. He spared Sparky. He spared his little pet. That's nice. The son of Saul's son, Jonathan, because of the oath of the Lord that was between David and Jonathan, Saul's son. So this has led to the belief. Now, see, this is part of the problem with how we want to understand this story. If you want to go with the faithful route, that David is actually doing the right thing, which brings us into all kinds of questions. Like, if you go with the faithful route, that David's actually being obedient, he doesn't want to kill Saul's family. Of course not. David's a good guy. But Yahweh is just telling him, you have to kill all these people. Why would Yahweh tell him to do that? That doesn't really make sense. Why would he delay the judgment so long? Why would he make David turn them over? And usually, if you say this is something that he's doing while being faithful, this is usually earlier in his reign. But if he's already honored Mephibosheth, then that implies that this is later in his reign. And David hasn't been particularly faithful later in his reign. So it's a little suspicious. Verse 8. But the king took Armani and Mephibosheth, who were the 2 sons from whom Rizpah, daughter of Aiah, had borne to Saul, and the 5 sons whom Merab, daughter of Saul, had borne to Adriel, son of Barzillai, the Mahalite, and handed them over to the Gibeonites. They hanged them on the hill in the presence of the Lord. The 7 of them died together. They were executed in the first days of the harvest at the beginning of the barley harvest. So, David hands them over, 7 of them, knowing they're going to be executed. This, depending on when this story occurred, it certainly changes the context of when he goes, is there anyone left from Saul's family I can show kindness to? He may have asked this because he turned over a bunch of them to the Gibeonites to be executed. Like he conveniently remembers, oh yeah, I was supposed to take care of them. This also is perhaps the context behind Shimei throwing rocks at him. Remember when Shimei shows up and throws rocks and calls him a murderer and says, you killed Saul's family and you weren't supposed to? And David's like, hey, and then his soldiers decided, should I kill him? He goes, no, he's not wrong. I did do that. And if you're wondering, like, why is the guy throwing rocks at him? When did he murder Saul's family? He turned over 7 of them to be executed by the Gibeonites. And also, I'm assuming at this point you may be thinking a little differently about Shimei and why he's so upset about the death of all of his family members. Keep in mind, Shimei is also on David's hit list because he threw rocks at him. Verse 10. Rizpah, Aiah's daughter, took sackcloth and spread it out for herself on the rock from the beginning of the harvest until the rain poured down from heaven on the bodies. She kept the birds of the sky from them by day and the wild animals by night. So you got this one woman who takes the bodies and she wants to honor them. Verse 11, when it was reported to David what Saul's concubine Rizpah, daughter of Aiah, had done, he went and got the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan from the leaders of Jabesh Gilead. They had stolen from them from the public square of Bethshan, where the Philistines had hung the bodies the day the Philistines killed Saul at Gilboa. David had the bones brought from there. They gathered up the bones of Saul's family who had been hung and buried the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan at Zelah in the land of Benjamin in the tomb of Saul's father Kish. They did everything the king commanded after this. God answered prayer for the land. So now we've got Saul. He's been dug up. Jonathan's been dug up. And these family members have all been dug up. And now they've been reburied at the tomb in Benjamin. So now that they're all dead, David's willing to honor them. This seems to add further credence to Joab's complaint that David tends to be kinder to his enemies, and even those who are dead, than those who are living. So that's pretty much it for the story. And this brings us to what on earth is the point? What is the moral of the story? Why tell us this now? And this is a story that commentaries and they don't know. It's very confusing to them. And I think that this story does serve a purpose. I think it has a very important purpose, especially here in the epilogue. We often think that it's good to be king. Right? Some of you get the reference, some of you don't. We think it's good to be king. We think that being king means you get to do whatever you want, you get all the blessings, everything's great, and so on. But there's a reason why this story, right, it comes at the beginning of the epilogue, and we're going to get David's senses at the end of the epilogue. Because regardless of whether or not David is being faithful, and so he's just doing what God told him to do, or he's acting on his own, using this as an excuse to get revenge against Saul's family, the fact is, the point seems to be, Saul, whether it was intentional or whether he actually did it, as king, right, in his capacity of king, he has taken action that is going to result not only in the land being blamed, right, you have this famine that seems to be associated with Saul, you also have his family that's being judged. So, as king, it's true, you are not held to the same standards as the average peon. You are the administrator of justice, and as such, you are above the law. You have to be. You have to be above the law to enforce the law. That doesn't mean that there's not going to be repercussions. As the representative of Israel, Israel will suffer when you sin. And just because you may be untouchable doesn't mean your family is untouchable. We see this with Saul. Israel is punished for some of Saul's sins, and his own family is punished for his sins. Now, you can go with the faithful route and say David is just following orders. That's fine. In which case, the point is, David is experiencing that Saul, with this sort of with this lingering sin, is going to result in punishment for Israel and for his family until it's all been atoned for, which results in Saul's family being killed. This is a lesson for David. If you sin, Israel, the nation, will suffer, and your family will suffer. So I think that this is why this story is here. So we have this story of David, and he needs to learn this lesson. Unfortunately, he doesn't really learn this lesson, right? One of the best examples of this is his affair with Bathsheba. David is not punished for it. His child is punished for it, because David is untouchable. He is the king. He is above the law. There's a reason, I think, why this, again, the epilogue begins with this sin of Saul and is going to end with one of David's sins, which will result in Israel being punished. Because David's not going to be punished for it. He can't be punished again. We'll get back to this when we get to the end of the book. We do have this last little story, and we'll kind of run through it real quick, which is, it's just here on the end. Verse 15, the Philistines again waged war against Israel. David went down with his soldiers, and they fought the Philistines, but David became exhausted. Then Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of the giant, whose bronze spear weighed about 8 pounds and who wore new armor, intended to kill David. But Abishai, son of Zeruiah, came to his aid, struck the Philistine, and killed him. Then David's men swore to him, "You must never again go out with us to battle. You must not extinguish the lamp of Israel." This is a bit interesting because we actually have an entire psalm, Psalm 18, dedicated to about David and about how God's protected him in battle and kept him strong and agile, and he can leap over bodies and he can fight forever and so on and so forth. But here we get this story about David's getting kind of old. He can't fight like he used to. And apparently he got a little too close for comfort in the fray, and now his men aren't, they don't want him fighting anymore. Because if the king dies, that's it. There's a reason why in chess, I've already brought this up, there's a reason why in chess, if the king dies, the game's over. Like, you don't even kill the king, you just check the king, and that's it. So the soldiers don't want David fighting anymore. This may give us some context for why he's not with the army, but even still, Saul was leading his army well into his 60s. He may not have been fighting. We say this with the David and Goliath story, right? There's a reason why I think Saul doesn't fight Goliath. It's probably because he's already in his 40s and he knows he's not going to stand much of a chance against this giant. But he's still with the army. He still leads the army. This may be the answer to that question. Why isn't David leading the army anymore? But it doesn't seem like a great excuse to me. You can still lead the army and not be fighting in the midst of it. Verse 18, after this, there was another battle with the Philistines at Gob. At that time, Sibbecai the Hushathite killed Saph, who was one of the descendants of the giant. Once again, there was a battle with the Philistines at Gob, and Elhanan, son of Jerah, Origim the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath the Gittite. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam. There's no way around this. We're just going to pull the Band-Aid off. Some of you may have just, like, why does it say this? I thought David killed Goliath. We get a clarification in Chronicles. This is supposed to be the brother of Goliath. I don't know why the word brother isn't there. But Chronicles tells us that this is not Goliath specifically. In verse 20, at Gath there was still another battle. A huge man was there with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. In all, he too was descended from the giant. When he taunted Israel, Jonathan, son of David's brother Shimei, killed him. These 4 were descended from the giant in Gath and were killed by David and his soldiers. So this seems to be an account of not only David's fighting with the Philistines, which we know happened over the course of his reign, but also that he fought other giants and that they were killed by other men. This seems to be connected to, because we're going to see in the epilogue, if we can go back, that there's going to be a listing of his champions, the great mighty men of David. So David was not the only giant killer. He had other great men who fought alongside him. But it's not a particularly great climax to end on, but we'll stop there for tonight.
I saw this meme that said, "I'm too old to fight, too tired to run, so I just shoot." That may have been David's thing right there. But anyway, let's close. John, would you close us in prayer?